So, the Elden Ring DLC is finally come and gone, and unfortunately, it didn't really answer something that's been bugging me ever since the DLC was announced, well over a year ago. We've always known that the DLC would probably take place somewhere outside the Lands Between, yet when it was announced, this image, and the description of the Land of Shadow, generated a lot of speculation about how the new location would connect to the base game. It had been guessed correctly that the player would likely follow Mikola by reaching his cocoon in Mogwin Palace, suggesting that everything in the Land of Shadow might be taking place in a dream, or another plane of reality altogether. On top of that, it's said that the Land of Shadow is obscured from the Lands Between by something called Marika's Veil. Personally, I really expected that the ending of the DLC would somehow reveal that the Veil was some sort of physical item in the Lands Between, sort of how Brainiac keeps the shrunken city of Kandor in a bottle in the Superman comics. Or it might have even ended with the Veil being removed and the Shadowlands physically rejoining the Lands Between. Of course, neither happened, with the ending changing almost nothing about the base game or the Land of Shadow. And I think this might have been a consequence of a rushed development in conjunction with the massive scope of the DLC. And I'm going to say something that I could have never imagined saying 6 months ago. I think the DLC might have needed a few more months of development time. That's not to say that I thought it was bad at all. It was more Elden Ring, and that alone makes it a 10 out of 10. But with the massive scope of the story it was trying to tell, being almost a sequel's worth of content, as well as the long wait for release, meant that it was always bound to create some kind of false expectations. Something in the Land of Shadow really did intrigue me, however, and it altered my entire frame of reference on the DLC. At this location in the upper gravesite plain, you can find a location called the Suppressing Pillar, with an inscription that says, quote, "The very center of the Lands Between. All manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed." At this point, I had been ready to accept that the Realm of Shadow was completely disconnected from the Lands Between. But, discovering this, it would seem to suggest that the Land of Shadow, or this location at the very least, once physically connected to the Lands Between, and moreover that this pillar was located geographically at its center. A quick look at Elden Ring's map would place the center somewhere in this conspicuously large bay, located between Liurnia, Limgrave, Caelid, and the Altus Plateau. Overlying the two maps, you will find that they don't fit together, at least not really. The jagged peak seemingly exists right on top of Caelid, and the Cerulean coast overlaps Limgrave. In addition, the Divine Tower of Liurnia would jut out right into the middle of Buhlerat, and the Caelid Colosseum right into the Abyssal Wood. But if one considers that these structures were most likely built later, after the age of the Erd Tree and thus Marika's reign as a god had already began, then there are some compelling coincidences which might make this theory somewhat likely. First off, it had been pointed out that the Erd Tree's in-game location doesn't actually match with the icon on the map. And considering this, it actually fits in quite nicely with the location of the Shadow Tree. Of course, this would be contingent on the fact that the two are actually the same entity, something that I don't know is ever confirmed within the DLC itself. Although it had been long theorized that the tree only appears black and twisted here because its residents were once enemies of the Erd Tree. Secondly, the Shadow Keep would exist next to what would become Leyndell, and may have once connected via the infamous Bridge to Nowhere. Although the jutting peninsula containing this large chalice structure would overlap, which overall I think was only designed to be a red herring in the marketing material, keeping us from realizing that the real Divine Gate was located in Inyar Lim. The Scadu Altus biome beyond would also seemingly imply that these lands were once a part of the Altus Plateau. And if the Hornsent are indeed the Crucible worshipping culture which existed before the age of the Erd Tree, again, something I don't think is explicitly confirmed by the DLC, it is possible that this arena behind the castle, containing the Shadow Tree avatar, may have at one point led to the deeper depths. To the west, I think the ruins of Rao fit nicely into this niche between Liurnia and Limgrave, with Buhlerat to the south. A lot of the pillar architecture here really reminds me of some areas of Limgrave, but I can't say if this is intentional or more likely a reuse of assets. Given how height interacts with game design in Elden Ring, I think that the gravesite plain in Buhlerat probably existed below Leyndell in the Altus Plateau, connecting to or possibly even below Liurnia. One thing I haven't found discussed much is that in this configuration, Jarberg would be located just on the other side of Buhlerat, and might at one time have connected to Beulah Jail, where the Hornsen were trying to create the living jars by combining amalgamations of flesh. Perhaps this settlement was once founded by escapees, or it may have even been the exit point of the Divine Gate of Inirlin, if Beulah was indeed located below Liurnia. Next, the Elak River might seemingly connect to this river in Limgrave, which flows out of Egghill Lake, leaving the Cerulean coast to somehow exist over Limgrave, which is probably the weakest part of this theory. Overall, the color scheme and theme of this location would seem to imply a connection to those who live in death, or possibly even the Carians, although this area is pretty barren lore-wise. It's possibly another casualty of rush development. Caelid and Dragonbarrow would also seemingly exist under the Jagged Peak, which might make some sense, as it seems that this was an area that the dragons once seemingly inhabited. We can also infer from the base game that the crumbling city of Farum Azula has been moving for some time. Its ruins haven't been dropped all over the lands between, so the floating city may have existed above or even connected to the Jagged Peak at one time. Finally, I like the symmetry between the peninsulas contained in the Finger Ruins of Dio and the Bastille Sanctum. But overall, it's a pretty awkward fit, with some interesting coincidence. The idea that Marika used her newfound power as a god to physically call out a massive segment of the world is a compelling image, although it still remains entirely possible, and probably more likely, that the Shadow Realm was never meant to be physically connected to the lands between in any way. Additionally, it had been suggested that the Shadowlands may comprise many different biomes called out of the lands between by Marika. Before the DLC released, some suggested that the Realm of Shadow might have been a sort of jail, where Marika sent things that were deemed heretical to the Golden Order. Of course, now we know that Marika actually veiled the Shadowlands so that no one could repeat her process of becoming a god. Furthermore, I don't know what would be deemed so heretical about certain elements in the Realm of Shadow that would necessitate their removal, while many other heretical elements still exist in the lands between. And at the end of the day, I think the simplest explanation is simply that there is not supposed to be some perfect explanation, or configuration which will make everything fit together. FromSoft has always been primarily focused on gameplay, and I highly doubt that everything included in the DLC was planned when Elden Ring was released. So I think what's most likely is that FromSoft included ideas for interesting biomes and experiences as they developed the DLC, beginning with some ideas that were scrapped from the base game but ballooning into a 2-year development time, with only a secondary focus on how this would fit into pre-established lore. And there's nothing wrong with that, and I think what makes their game so interesting is that some questions will never be definitively answered, which will keep us speculating about a game for years after it's been released. So this has just been some spitballing about my ideas after finishing Shadow of the Erdtree. Let me know what your thoughts on this mystery is, and stay tuned. I don't think I'm done talking about Elden Ring just yet.